may have to talk my way through this argument without having the visual images for you, so just trust that everything I say is actually true. And that'll make it go much more smoothly. I'm going to start, first of all, as other people have started, by thanking Frederic, by thanking my very old and dear friend Ray Sonnenschein, all of you, Paris. This has been a terrific conference. I've learned a tremendous amount. I've taken lots of notes. I'm going to be in touch with everybody who's spoken so far to get more information from all your research and so on. What I'm going to do this morning is a very broad mapping project, not mapping in the literal sense that we've seen maps for the last couple of days, but rather mapping in a more metaphorical sense, taking a bird's eye view, a very high level view of the relationship across 8 countries of immigration regimes, the types of immigrants who are brought in or who choose to come in under those regimes, looking at that in comparison with education regimes. I can say a little bit about why I've chosen education as the sort of the focal point for this work. Education regimes which mostly don't have to do with immigrants or immigration or ethnic minorities per se, and then comparing that against educational outcomes as measured by test scores from PISA, from a cross-country survey of outcomes, test scores in 2000, 2003, 2006, as a way of trying to compare immigration, intra-nation or intra-state practices, and schooling outcomes. So this is a very broad bird's eye view across 8 different countries, across some very large dimensions. There's all kinds of problems with this, which I'll say now because you'll all say them later if I don't, or maybe you will in any case. One of them is that all of these things are not precisely comparable across countries, and the kind of data that I'm going to be using has all kinds of problems. Any single measure isn't measured exactly the same across different countries. Test scores may not be a very good indicator of schooling outcomes. The category immigrants is itself deeply problematic in ways that we've talked about for the last couple of days, et cetera, et cetera. So, recognizing all those issues that are both empirical, measurement, also conceptual, political, whole bunch of problems, I'm going to set them all aside and go ahead anyway. And then we can talk later about which of these problems are so significant that this whole project does or doesn't work, or rises or falls depending on how I solve that problem. So the conventional wisdom that I start with is that Canada is sort of the model for good immigration policies and good immigrant incorporation. Bloomrod, a former colleague of mine now at the University of California, Berkeley, makes this argument most explicitly, but lots of people do. That Canada and its both federal and provincial governments welcome immigrants, the public opinion welcomes immigrants, immigrants are relatively quickly incorporated, they have relatively high social and economic status, they are relatively less isolated, nothing is perfect, but Canada works pretty well on balance. The contrasting case that people often present is, unfortunately, France, where France has not particularly welcomed with open arms a variety of immigrants. People are relatively socially, physically, geographically, politically isolated in all the ways we've talked about the last couple of days. There have, of course, been riots and protests by immigrants or immigrant descendants or ethnic minorities about their lack of incorporation. There are severe religious tensions and so on. So that's the kind of the starting contrast that people often make. I don't plan to disagree with that explicitly, except that I want to say by the end of this talk that the world is a lot more complicated than that, and that at least by the measures that I'm looking at, Canada doesn't come out looking quite so good, and France doesn't come out looking quite so bad. And there's a lot more complexity when you begin to measure both of those countries against others. So the picture starts. That's not my picture. Everything I say is true. It's a great picture. I'm comparing across 8 different countries. I'll tell you which ones in a moment. I'm comparing immigration regimes to education outcomes, partly because conceptually, analytically, I think it's very important that we move across the research in this field tends to focus either on immigration or on ethnic minorities or on outcomes or something. And I think it's from the perspective of the lives of the individuals and from the perspectives of policymakers and politics, those ought to be thought of as a seamless unity rather than separate analytic questions. And in the end, I want to at least suggest that there are complicated normative judgments, complicated evaluations about what's a good and a bad immigration regime and set of outcomes. Very briefly, a couple of definitions. What do I mean if I talk about immigrant incorporation? That's one of the indexes that I'll talk about. You can divide it in 17 different ways, all of which are plausible. I'm simply going to give both a narrow and a broad definition and say, pick whichever one you're most interested in. Narrowly defined immigrant incorporation means that immigrants and their families, their descendants, can act relatively effectively in the host country that they move to. They can kind of more or less get what they want, more or less. A much broader definition of immigrant incorporation would be the idea that being foreign-born, or being the descendant of a foreign-born, being an ethnic minority perhaps, doesn't have any explanatory role in your life chances or your trajectory. You're just as likely to get the education, to live where you want, to be elected to office, to get the political outcomes you want. Okay. This actually is an earlier version. Okay, so my purpose, dimensional wisdom, I just talked about that. I'm complicating the picture, I've talked about that. So here I am in the definitions. Thank you very much. Okay, immigrant incorporation can be narrowly or broadly defined. Similarly, an incorporation regime can be defined as better or worse in both narrow and broad senses. Again, I'm just going to offer a couple of definitions and let you choose among them. A narrow definition of a good immigration regime is that on balance, either the immigrants and their families or the receiving country, or preferably both, are roughly speaking better off than they would be if the migration hadn't occurred, if you imagine the counterfactual. A broad definition is that they are not just better off by some criterion, but they actually both feel good, feel positive, think that this was a successful and appropriate move to make. And the broadest definition of a successful incorporation regime would be that, roughly speaking, everybody, the worst off residents of the host country and the worst off immigrants themselves, all agree that this was a good choice. I'm not going to make a lot of these definitions. I just want to point out that part of our debate over these issues involves a debate over what we count as a successful incorporation and successful regime. So the outline of the talk is I'm going to map 8 states' immigration regimes. I talked about that briefly a minute ago. I'm going to map them their schooling regimes. I'm going to map their educational outcomes. And then I'm going to compare indices from these 3 different mapping enterprises. Again, mapping is a metaphor, not as a literal geographic phenomenon. Okay, here are the 8 cases. 4 Anglophone countries, the United Kingdom and then its 3 former colonies. Continental Europe, Germany and France, because they're obvious cases. Belgium and Switzerland, which we thought were interesting because there were federal or regional cases. One certainly could, and in a later version of this, I'm going to add at least 1 Scandinavian country, perhaps Sweden, 1 Southern European country, Spain or Greece, so we can quibble about what countries, too many, too few, which ones, but for the moment, that's what I've got. Whoops, this is not very visible. But basically, this just shows you the immigration flows between about 1995 and 96 and 2005, roughly the decade before 2005. The top one shows with the United States, which of course had a much larger absolute number of immigrants. The bottom right shows you the same graph, just not including the United States, so that the scale is slightly larger. If you look at the foreign-born as actually a share of these countries' populations by 2005, roughly speaking, Australia and Switzerland, almost a quarter of their populations were immigrants. These are literal immigrants. These are foreign-born, not children or families. Canada is at 19%, the United States at about 12 or 13%, Germany the same, about 12, Belgium about 11%, France about 10%, UK about 8%. So they vary a lot. Roughly speaking, again, very roughly, you can double those proportions if you want to talk about immigrants and their children.